Morning.
How are you?
Would you like a hand with something? Can I help you?
No, I'm good. Thanks for
Okay.
asking. I appreciate it.
Morning.
Hello. Sorry, I'm always scared of being here. Just a few things to start today that I wanted to mention to make sure we're on the same page. Room 4, especially for our social science delegates, is not in the space that it was yesterday. It is down the long hallway with the other rooms for the next 2 days. So you don't have to go over to the executive suite for room 4 today. You just walk down the hallway and you'll hit it on your left-hand side. Let me know if you need further instructions on that. But basically all the parallel session rooms are now down that same hallway, with the exception that this is room 1 here. The other thing is that the dinner is tonight. If you need any help or instructions, let me know. We'll be out at the registration desk and there are a few spots open for the dinner. If anyone wants to join, we'll get started in about 5 minutes or so. Until then, I'll turn this microphone on. Thanks.
People thinking about it. How are you? Roger.
Good. That's gonna be good. Yes. No, they're just visiting, they're. Excuses that I'm good. Yeah. Yes.
Somebody got it for now at all. A lot of people come in.
Hello. What is it?
For you. For you. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of the conference. Again, just to reiterate what Tamsin said earlier this morning, room 4 is now in the same hall as all the rest of the rooms. So if you came in after she said that, all of the rooms are now on the same hall because we no longer have a space conflict with other things. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Robin Mansell, Dr. Robin Mansell. She is Professor Emerita from the Department of Media, Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She was a Professor of Information Communication Technology Policy at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex from 1998 to 2000. Her research focuses on technology and innovation, digital platform and governance, and its socio-political and economic consequences. She is the author of Imagining the Internet, Communication, Innovation, and Governance, 2012, and co-author of Advanced Introduction to Platform Economics in 2020, as well as over 120 papers. I can't read this early, apparently. She is a fellow of the British Academy and UK Academy of Social Sciences and a member of Academia Europa, and holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, and was awarded the ICAC Edward Baker Award. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robin Mansell, and we really look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Morning, everyone. Working? It's working. That was a pretty heavy duty introduction. It makes me sound like I'm an economist. And I promise you, I'm not a neo-Lapland. So, today, that's my title. And this is a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about geopolitics and the digital world. I'm going to talk a little bit about institutions and corporate goals. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how these geopolitics play out in everyday life. And then I'm going to talk about contradictory reactions and what we could do about the way in which the digital world is developing. The first line there says, first, a brief reflection. And this is just to put you in the mood for thinking about technologies. And before I read this to you, which I will do when the machine stops, think about what was being invented in the late 1890s. What was being invented? What do we have? We had telegraphy, we had the Kodak camera, we had the gas-powered automobile, we had the phonograph, we had the Marconi radio, and they were beginning to spread, yeah? And we also had the first data processing punch cards invented by a Holroth, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, in 1890, which were later used for what? During the Second World War, they were used by IBM to triage people, Jews and others during the Second World War. So just think about that. When I read to you this quote from 1909 by E.M. Forster, British author, the machine stops. We created the machine to do our will, but we cannot make it do our will now. It has robbed us of the sense of space and the sense of touch. It has blurred every human relation and narrowed down love to a carnal act. It has paralyzed our bodies and our wills and now compels us to worship it. The machine develops, but not on our lines. The machine proceeds, but not to our goal. But humanity and its desire for comfort had overreached itself. It had exploited the riches of nature too far. Quietly and complacently, it was sinking into decadence, and progress had come to mean the progress of the machine. Gives you some pause for thought, doesn't it? 1909, this is 2023, and we are still so prone to thinking that the machine is what is progressing. What I want to do today is to draw your attention to the fact that, yes, machines have been innovated throughout history, but what we really need to focus upon is the core theme of this conference, which is the agency of human beings in order to shape what is happening with machines. So where lies individual or collective agency to resist the machine? This seems to me to be a core problem that we have been addressing for decades and decades. I'll also put a quote from Habermas from a recent 2022 paper there, because in order for human beings to be knowledgeable enough to make decisions, whether individually or collectively, we need, he argues, a democratic system. And if the democratic system is damaged, if the infrastructure of the public sphere is no longer operational, it is impossible to direct citizens' attention to the relevant issues that need to be decided, like how to govern machines, and the possibility for forming different opinions, contested opinions, no longer exists. I put the little picture of the Great Library of Alexandria up there, partly just to echo history, but there was no time when knowledge was an open public sphere. It was elite in the beginning, and it remains elite, yes? But it just does not mean that there is no opportunity for making choices and for resisting the progress of the machine. So, with that little reflection to begin with, I want to focus a little bit on the geopolitics of the digital. And those iconic images up there do not need to be explained to you. It is very common knowledge that there is great tension between the great powers It's no longer a unipolar world led by the United States. There are mostly men in charge of developing digital machines these days. And there's much talk of the fact that in order to keep people safe, to protect their human rights, we need a kind of a nationalism, a techno-nationalism. And we hear in the press and we hear from policymakers very frequently that we need to draw boundaries if we can around national and sometimes regional, like EU spaces, in order to keep people safe and to make the best of the technology. This is a new form of protectionism. It affects trade flows, it affects information flows, it affects whether or not knowledge can circulate freely. It leads to fragmentation of Habermas's public sphere. I would never suggest that a perfect public sphere ever existed, but I would suggest that something like a public sphere is necessary in order for human beings to make decisions about how to govern technologies. The claim is, by Zuckerberg and many others who lead the development of today's digital technologies, the big tech platforms, that what they are doing is in the service of humanity. It is in the service of progressive moves to make a better world. It is in service of upholding human rights. They would never say that they're setting out self-consciously to downgrade human rights. It is to distribute the benefits of the new technologies of the digital world fairly, and also to distribute or to mitigate the risks as much as possible, and to do so in a way that is transparent. This is the claim that they make. And they also say that notwithstanding the enormous energy consumption of the new digital technologies, these developments are consistent with environmental sustainability. I don't think any of you in this audience is likely to buy that argument, but that is the trope that is so widely distributed. There are really few signs in all of the discourses around techno-nationalism, the fragmentation of the internet. There are very few signs that care has been taken to consider the implications of the new technologies, the new digital technologies for people in their everyday lives, whether they be citizens or whether they be refugees. So why is this the case? We heard in the first plenary yesterday by Professor Goes a lot about institutions and about voice. And it was really, really helpful to think about how the institutional setup itself enables the problems that we confront with the new digital technologies. One of the core institutional rules in contemporary society, at least in the Western world, is what? It is to ensure that capitalist rules and legislation grant rights to private capital to capture and monetize data. So this is the whole datafication discourse, the idea that companies can treat your data and my data as the economists would have it, the new oil, but actually, excuse me, as something that can just be appropriated and used for their own incentives to make profits. That is the foundation of the capitalist system. And it is very much assumed to be the case even in the Chinese capitalist system. And what does it do? It leads to conflict. It leads to conflict between the innovation agenda, which is to keep investing and pushing for the next generation of technology, and what have come to be known as public values such as the protection of privacy, freedom of expression. So we have this enduring conflict, freedom from surveillance. We also have conflict between corporate ambitions to make profits and citizens' rights, fundamentally, and quite often the state has similar interest to the companies. The state wants to support the companies to lead in the world global competition around digital technologies. So if we take it as read that the foundation of our institutional setup is to enable capitalist rules to support corporate ambitions, and that this leads to conflict, what are the questions we should be asking? One of the most common questions that gets asked is, if you tweak the rules a little bit, if you regulate, if you govern just a little bit differently, will that lead to empowerment of individuals to make choices for themselves about how they use digital technologies and when they use them, whether their children can access pornography online, for example? The question being, is empowerment enabled through introduction of new rules on terms that align with individuals' interests, or with what is permitted or allowed by state corporate power? Or alternatively, what scope is there for emancipation? So I'm using two different words here. Empowerment tends to mean a little bit more agency for individuals than they had before. For example, if you have literacy training, you might be able to discriminate between harmful and not harmful information. You can have more empowerment to decide that you won't trust a particular source of information. Emancipation is a term that is usually linked theoretically with much more critical theories of power, and we heard also from Professor Langford, of course, yesterday, a very rich menu of critical theories of power. And in those theories, the question is whether or not within the capitalist framework, there can be any notion of emancipation from the dark side of machines. So on the one hand, we can talk about governance and regulation that empowers individuals a little bit, or maybe a lot, but it's still operating within the capitalist framework. On the other hand, we can think about whether there are possibilities for true emancipation from the exploitative practices of a capitalist-driven system of digital innovation. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be thinking very much about whether or not the changes that are happening lead to empowerment in the sense of individual empowerment to make changes and choices, or whether they actually potentially lead to emancipation of individuals and collective groups to free themselves from the harms of dark machines. So, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but what are the principal goals of the digital platforms? I probably don't need to name them, but here we're talking about the Facebooks, the Metas, the commercial e-commerce platforms, some of the Chinese platforms like Weibo, etc. The principal ambition is global expansion for profit. Need I say more? But within that, the ambition of the big platforms is very much to make service agreements with you, the user, to maximize the core asset, which is what? Data. So whatever it is, under whichever regulatory regime, the main principal ambition is to maximize the value of data. In order to do that, many of these companies are engaged in strategic standardization. Strategic standardization is code for standardize the different technologies, user interfaces, but do so in a way that limits user control. Can you see emancipation happening when you limit user control? Not really. Secondly, to strategically manage content moderation in a way that so far, for most of the platforms, allows them to decide what is harmful content and what is not. Increasingly, new regulations are being introduced. But at the end of the day, it's individuals working within, usually low-paid individuals working within these companies who get to decide what is healthy or good content and what is harmful content. They respond to regulations, they often call for regulations. some of the companies come to the European Union and say, please regulate us. Because we know that you're a little bit unhappy with the kinds of developments around digital technologies, with the harms, etc. But as soon as regulation comes along, what do? They start lobbying. They start trying to weaken the legislation that is being put in place, or to prevent it from being properly implemented. And lastly, especially when it comes to discussions about artificial intelligence in the digital world, I don't know if any of you have counted how many sets of ethical principles have been developed in the last 5 or 6 years that are online, but you could count them and they're in the hundreds. So there are many, many ethical principles about good behavior in the design and development of new digital technologies in order to protect people's human rights. But how many of them are actually being implemented in a way which leads to tangible change that empowers individuals or emancipates them? Not many. Overall, the principal goal is still profitability. In response to the principal goals of the digital platforms, big companies, whether they be American-owned or Chinese-owned, or in some cases even European-owned, there are many multilateral, and in some cases multi-stakeholder responses. And there's lots of activity at the national level in terms of governing the digital world in order to constrain, limit, control the hegemony of the big platforms. I won't go into enormous detail on this. And interestingly, yesterday, I was intrigued to hear some skepticism about the role of the United Nations in being able to accomplish certain goals. But one of the major responses to concerns about digital harms has been the United Nations Secretary General's initiative to develop a new global digital compact. And here, the initiative has been going on for a couple of years now. It is basically designed to uphold human rights, fundamental human rights in the digital world. It's being said to be put on almost the same footing as the IPCC and concerns about climate change. In other words, in the political classes, the concerns about the potential harms of digital innovation and digital technologies and applications is growing. But what is characteristic of the digital global digital compact and some of the guidelines that are being put in place? First is none of them are mandatory. They're not talking about treaties, they're talking about voluntary things. Second is they make a lot of the need to protect fundamental human rights and the rights of children. But at the same time, they say that must be balanced with interests in economic growth and in continuous innovation, more machines, more AI, etc. In other words, there's call for coordination, there's calls for collaboration, there's calls for putting the best minds together to figure out how we might better protect the human rights of individuals in the contemporary period. But there are no teeth. And there is no suggestion that we basically need a new form of economic functioning. There is no threat to capitalism anywhere in the discourse that is coming from the Global Digital Compact. At least that's my assessment. And it's based on a content analysis of a lot of documentation. Secondly, UNESCO, a UN agency which is known for upholding human rights, freedom of expression, rights to education, the rights of children, etc. They are developing new guidelines for regulating digital platforms. And once again, if you read through the various drafts that are coming out, and it is quite multi-stakeholder, a lot of voices involved. What does it call for? Protection of fundamental human rights. But what the paragraphs also call for? Economic growth and innovation around technology. On the one hand, on the other hand, a balance. With UNESCO, you might even say putting fundamental rights a little bit higher up on the scales, but nevertheless, you still have this strong emphasis on the current arrangements and institutional norms for capitalism. And when you push back, what are we told? Do not harm, do no harm to the operation of capitalism and digitization and innovation. Why? Because we're facing global crises. And if you do something to destabilize digital innovation, which is the main growth prospect, what are you doing? You're creating harm for those people who want jobs, who need to make a livelihood, etc. So it's a very contested conversation. In the OECD countries, rather than introduce necessarily new guidelines, what they perpetually do is call for more research in order to mitigate the risks that might accompany the development of digital technologies. More research, more research, more research. So when you actually have a solid evidentiary basis for introducing whatever regulations may be possible, they talk about introducing future guardrails. Guardrails having become the catchword, I guess, for protecting people from the potential harms of digital technologies. The G7 talk about, and the US talk about, responsible innovation. Well, who would be irresponsible? I mean, policymakers don't go set out necessarily to be irresponsible. To do responsible innovation in the digital space, they claim, is the way forward. But again, it's through voluntary policy guidance in most cases, through putting principles in place, but not necessarily following through in terms of practice. In the UK, given the government that we now have, it's very, very pro innovation and economic growth at all costs, of course, with some protections, some effort to mitigate any harms that might come from technology. And in the EU, not sure how many of you are aware, but there has been a massive new packages of legislation passed in recent times: Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, the Data Protection Act, and Privacy Protection, all of which creating more and more text, which allows us to feel that regulations are being put in place, with far less resources devoted to the actual implementation of that legislation. And so it's unclear whether it's having the kind of traction that one might hope for. In the UK, the Online Safety Bill has been publicly called authoritarian. This is a democratic state. It's publicly been called authoritarian. Why? Because it enables the Secretary of State to intervene, to decide, if necessary, in the national interest, what is allowable discourse and content and what is not. How independent is that? Does that empower individuals? Does it emancipate them? I think not. So, two examples of the way in which these kinds of contradictions work themselves out. The first, I very briefly say something about is 5G. 5G is the new variation of mobile or broadband networks. You don't have to know about the technical details of this. The key characteristic is that it introduces far more automation, artificial intelligence into the periphery of the networks, and in the core, it also exists. It is the next scaling up of communicative ability across the world, faster, et cetera, all deemed to be good things, handling more and more data in order to profit from datafication. The story is led by the US, that the Chinese are introducing this technology with all sorts of backdoors and spy capabilities, which will allow them to get access to security secrets in the West. And therefore, Chinese companies should be banned. They are the bad actors. They are the ones who are engaged in using this kind of technology to surveil. On the other hand, the same technology in the hands of Western companies is deemed to be good, provided by good actors who are always concerned with protecting your privacy and your security. the research that we've done in this area shows that it's a matter of differences in degree as to how much threat there is to people's security as a result of the development of these networks. And that the United States and other Western countries are as capable of spying, surveilling you as the Chinese. They just do it to a different degree. So any kind of technology, innovation in this area heightens the risk to human beings, to individuals, and to groups of individuals. And rights protection in the West differs in degree, I would suggest, but not in principle from China. And therefore, a lot of the scaring about the need for the fragmentation, building boundaries around networks is a construction, which is not consistent with the reality of the way digitization is developing. And the other one I wanted to mention, because everybody's mentioning it, is general artificial intelligence, or chat GPT. We had a discussion yesterday about some of these issues. I put the market share information up there because really chat GPT is about more and more data being collected and used in the cloud. It could be real data scraped from your interactions online, or it can be synthetic data, which is more and more being developed in order to drive these artificial intelligence chat GPT engines. And you can see there that the big cloud infrastructure companies in the West and in China generated some 63 billion in the first quarter of 2023. That's a lot of money. That is the incentive, one of the incentives that is driving more and more investment in artificial intelligence and generalized artificial intelligence. At the same time, the companies are claiming that they are developing these technologies for good, data for good. They are also exploiting geographical areas like looking for this scarce minerals in Brazil. Apple and Microsoft and Amazon are doing, which means what? Attacks on the environment. Whoops. Sorry, that's so like talking too long. Can I do another 5 minutes? The principal purpose of developing these next generation technologies is to gain market share. So the same economic incentive that has been there all along is what is driving the market. And the same geopolitics and rivalry between different parts of the world, and different companies in different parts of the world, is to gain market share. There are lots of concerns, as all of you will know, whether in the classroom or more generally about things like chat GPT. But what happens is that even when countries decide, like Italy did or France did temporarily, to try to stop the development of this particular technology, the main concern that they began to have was about the ownership of the data. And so they were very concerned about whether the institutional rules actually allow companies to go and scrape all that data to create the data sets so that the machines can learn and develop more sophistication. And then they realized that actually under the arrangements in which the rules are set under capitalism, the companies do have the right, at least for now, until courts get busy, to allow the scraping of all of this data and the development of more sophisticated language models. So they back off. And so in terms of whether or not regulations will be quickly put in place in order to empower users, I would say the answer is probably not. And in addition, something called artificial intelligence as a service is being developed, where basically there is no consent on your part as to how data are used, none whatsoever. All that data gets collected in the cloud, and there's no value chain accountability as to which companies are using which data, especially when it's all combined and anonymized. And so we basically have an innovation machine which is potentially not consistent with the protection of fundamental rights. And very little you or I, or most policymakers arguably can do about it. So, in response to all of this, what do we have? We have huge literatures growing on the benefits of artificial intelligence and the next generation digital networks. And I won't go through all of the good applications, and I'm sure some of you will say, well, these are good applications. But what we have at the same time is a race to try to control or regulate the recommender systems and the algorithms that use these technologies. And the consequences of that are content over blocking, which means restrictions on freedom of expression, and also racial profiling. And in the case of educational uses of these kinds of technologies, we have to cope with the biases, which have been there for a very long time with earlier generations of technology, and discrimination between classes and races and groups. And I could give you endless examples of limitations on people's human rights and the need for regulatory oversight. So what are the reactions? From the companies, we get like OpenAI, which has developed the most recent ChatGPT. These models are becoming more and more potent. Some points, it will become quite easy if one wanted to cause a great deal of harm with these models. And you might ask, well, if that's the case, why on earth are you putting them out there in the market? And on the other side, though, and here's the push to economic growth, slowing the deployment of technologies in favor of added cybersecurity, greater safety for youth, could prevent physical or psychosocial harms. However, such slowing could doom American companies in the race to the market. Geopolitics again. Do nothing to jeopardize economic growth of Western countries. Other reactions, far more critical. Many of you will have heard of Shoshana Zuboff, who talks about the need for societies to decide what should be done. But the intriguing thing with her take on this is that she turns to the EU and says, there's a bright light in terms of their regulatory move to try to control technologies, because the EU is trying to uphold human rights and to empower individuals. We could talk about whether or not she's right to be so optimistic about EU moves to regulate and control. Possibly they will empower users, but will they emancipate them? Frank Pasquale, who's an American legal scholar, talks about the need for utopian visions to completely move away from the institutional setup that we have now and to think in entirely new ways about how we might configure, design, and develop these technologies to actually enable people. He talks about empowerment, not in emancipation. And then finally, Naomi Klein, who's a Canadian political economist, talks about the fact that we worry about the intrinsic characteristics of the technology. So there's a lot of talk about ChatGPT hallucinating, dreaming up footnotes and stories for student essays that have no bearing on reality. What she's talking about is the fact that we need to focus on the people, not the technology. We need to focus on the CEOs, and I would argue the technology designers, who are developing these technologies without regard, seriously and fundamentally, to the protection of human beings. So my way of conclusion, it's all about power, of course. Yes, I put that in quotes because it's a quote from Roger Silverstone some 20 years ago, who talked about the development of digital technologies. It's all about the power of force. And it is. It's about the hegemony of economic power. It's about the dominant big tech companies, imaginary of what a robust data-driven world should look like. It's a utopian dream of a competitive marketplace with the United States against other parts of the world. The examples I gave you of 5G broadband networks and AI are just geopolitical projects in some ways that ensure that states and companies can manipulate data to serve their profit-driven ends. The dominant vision, or imaginary if you like, succeeds all too often in visibilizing the consequences of these developments for my everyday life, your everyday life, and people around the world. And so if we really want to think about what needs to happen, we might conclude, and I do conclude, that empowerment, greater literacy training, greater abilities to actually make choices as to whether or not to go online and where to go when you do, what technologies to use, is simply not enough. What we really need is emancipation, which requires that tech systems do not monetize data. And what this means is a change in ownership conditions and the fundamental institutional norms of capitalism, which then means something like a commons-based approach, or you've heard of some of the federated platforms, distributed platforms that are being developed, because no matter how likely that kind of radical change might be, I would argue that it is the only way out of a continuous, step-by-step encroachment on people's fundamental human rights as a result of tech innovation. Thank you.
So at this point, we'll take questions from the room.
This was really fascinating. Thank you. I'm right here in the front. I'm hard of hearing, so you'll always find me in the room. I'm wondering what advice you give to us as educators for our students who look at all of the available information out there and they say, well, this could be true, or that could be true, or this, how do we deal with the misinformation and disinformation campaigns when you've got all of these competing motives? And we can point them to the research, but then you have things like ChatGPT. Is that real? Is it not? I was wondering if you could speak on, maybe giving us some advice for those naysayers in my classes.
Thank you. Let me preface what I say by the fact that in the big picture, I don't think any amount of critical literacy training can solve the kind of problems that I've been describing. I think that they are like a Band-Aid, but Band-Aids are better than nothing. So I would never say do nothing and just wait. I would say that critical literacy training is essential. By that I mean for students in the classroom and politicians and basically all citizens. What is needed is a greater growing awareness of the need to be able to discriminate. And where you cannot discriminate, as increasingly you cannot discriminate, to realize what some of the forces are that are giving rise to this absolute crescendo of information, some of which has some kind of truth value, some of which does not. And one needs to start not just with, keyboard training and STEM training, but with the whole variety of areas. And in this country, Ofcom has had a mandate to provide funding and support for digital literacy training for, goodness, it must be 20 years now. Tiny budgets. So, if there was real core concern about this, including in schools around the world, we would be spending more on it, but we don't. We talk about how nice it would be to train the teachers, to train the students, but it just is a drop in the bucket. And my argument is it is a drop in the bucket because it is not taken seriously, because there are these overriding factors.
I'm going to take a little bit of moderator privilege and ask that question, if you don't mind. So one of the big battles that we're seeing emerging in the 21st century is the idea of body sovereignty and who owns your body. And parallel to that, from your presentation, I see sort of this data sovereignty that, our data, our lives, our digital life is sort of an extension of kind of our body sovereignty. Do you have any ideas or thoughts about how we as individuals can take more ownership of our own digital aspect of our life.
There are some moves afoot. You remind me of, Marshall McLuhan's, extension of man kind of notion. And the sort of sensory, the no division between the sensory body and the sort of data sensorium. Do I have any suggestions? I mean, there are initiatives underway to lock up your data, put you as a person, a human being, in control of whatever images are floating around out there, developed based on your activities or the activities of third parties. The issue that I have with it is not that they should be stopped. I think far more funding should go into them. Data lockers and intermediaries of various types who would allow you to make some choices about what happens to the representation of your body in the world. But the problem is they devolve the responsibility back to you as an individual. And the whole problem is, why do we expect individuals to spend their time, their resources on managing their bodies, if you like, the extensions of their bodies, because someone else is creating a possibility for harm? This is madness, right? It just tips the scales, the balance of the scales in the wrong direction. I'm not against technology, but I am against the notion that ultimately it is down to the individual to look after themselves. I mean, what more libertarian and anarchistic notion can there be? What we need is a fundamental change in the rules, institutional rules that underpin society as a whole. And I'm not an optimist that that's coming anytime soon, but I would be as pessimistic about the long-term outcomes and what will happen to the representation of your body and you and discrimination and all that sort of stuff if nothing happens. I would say it is on the part of climate change.
Over there and the one in the center. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Oh, okay.
I've been broadcasting my voice for 30 years, so I'm not very used to this. I find your concept of where you call for responsible innovation needs to be parallel with responsible operating to follow up on that. So the concept of emancipation, and what I understand from this, is that the system out there has people so addicted to these cell phones and laptops that they cannot disengage from it. And they're putting out mass volumes of data. And I find myself in talks with some of my colleagues and friends that go, you've turned off your phone or you're not on your phone for tasks. I'm perfectly comfortable not being online. But the system that they have has hooked in millions, billions of people to be contributing data because they can't push their task down. So the responsibility of the individual, I have to disagree. They have to make the choice to determine when they go online as much as where they go on.
Thank you for that. I agree that it's not a story about the denial of all individual choice. It's a story about where and how individuals are enabled to live their lives. And so I would come back to the collective response in the case you're talking about, whether it be corporate or it be universities that decide no emails on weekends or after 5 o'clock, which is something that LSE has done. And there's a libertarian outcry when we do that. And all sorts of people who rose up and said, you're not going to tell me when I can send an email or be expected to respond to an email. So even when you get a collective agreement, a temporary respite in all of this squabbling over who should do what with what technology, you get a backlash. And this is caused by the fact that the whole design of the system is, as you describe it, an attention economy, which sucks people in and makes them addicted to the need to be doing this all the time. So I would say if you think about emancipation, you might imagine, I know it's hard to imagine, a system that was not designed to make money out of an attention economy, but still brought some of the benefits of these technologies to people to allow them to have robust communicative spaces. And so on.
Hi, thank you for bringing up the online safety bill. It's a big part of my research, and it's quite frightening actually, the use of proactive technologies and behavioral profiling essentially that it lays out. But I gave a lecture on it about 2 weeks ago, and somebody said, do you feel that what essentially we give up is worth it to implement the bill and to implement the protections that the UK government wish to implement? Are you finding that people are more willing to make that sacrifice?
Well, I suppose I could respond in a couple of ways. I mean, people are becoming less and less concerned about their individual privacy. People in surveys, although I'm not sure it's a good thing to ask people about what they don't know about, but nevertheless, people's responses to surveys are that they are very concerned about safety of children, particularly. And insofar as the online safety bill seems to be going after making changes that would allow greater protections of children, then it is very hard to differ than to, say, don't do this. But the problem is, because the technology has arrived at the stage that it has, in order to do that, it is pretty much going to be necessary to decrypt or cause the companies not to decrypt their messages. Unless you have, full play. I don't want to get into technical details, but what we are giving up is what the companies have said is good for us, which is encryption and privacy. Yeah? In order to open up the technology box to allow greater protections of children and to some extent adults, and to protect us from extremists and all the rest of it. So, where do I come down? I think my view is they should flip up the bill and start again, because if you want the honest truth, because I really think they have developed an complicated piece of legislation, which is never going to be implemented anyway, because there'll be court cases that go on for decades.
I wanted to back you up.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My PhD is on platform, just your work is reference, so it's wonderful to meet you. My question is about legislative pluralism. When the EU has this large digital package of multiple legislations, to what extent do you think that this is just legislative pluralism aimed at big tech? Because the DSA and the GMA focuses on gatekeeping platforms, which are larger platforms. What about smaller platforms? Which leads to my next question of balancing regulation and innovation. This is a possible potential in larger developed global north countries, but in global south countries where innovation is the key for for country development, how do you balance regulation and innovation?
Thank you. On the EU pluralism, the idea is if you go after the big companies and tweak their behavior somewhat, this will set a context for the smaller companies and they will follow suit. But there's lots of evidence in the economic literature that they might all start competing to the bottom and things get worse. I think that it needs to be monitored, and I fully support some of the approach the EU has been taking, because again, I would emphasize my view is not that we should do nothing, but my view is also that even in doing something and introducing this set of packages of legislation, they're not actually addressing the fundamental underlying problem, which is why I talk about the need for emancipation, not just empowerment. On the global south issue, how do we balance? Well, I guess I would delete balance from my vocabulary, because if you think about balancing, think about the scales, you get a better balance between innovation on the one hand and human rights protection on the other hand, like this. You still have all of the pressures and all of the incentives created by the innovation growth agenda, which, you know, in no world will they ever stay balanced just like that. It will always be like that, so there'll always be a struggle. So unless you change the underlying rules and norms, you're going to have a problem. The other thing I would say about the global south is my global south colleagues tell me all the time. It's a matter of it's harm to transfer legislation from the global north to the global south with a few tiny tweaks here and there. Even when that doesn't happen, the values that may be going to be privileged in the global south are likely to be different. And secondly, even if there was consensus that the same things had to be done, say to put legislation in something against the big platforms, it's an aspiration in the global south because the resources aren't there. I don't think we're here, global north either, but they're not there in the global south, etc. And so it's a nothing good.
I have a question. Yeah. The institutional alternatives that you present, common-based alternatives. One of the contradictions we face in the AI world is that the more that we assign to the commons, the more they stray. And so, how do we consider this public-private tension to an AI lens right now? Do we want more private, or do we want more private, more privacy? Commons that are bounded, that don't have access to these other tech spaces. What's the institutional language of the appropriation from the commons is now a big part of what AI does.
To be honest, I'm not quite sure how to respond to you. I could give you another lecture on the commons, but I don't think that's probably very much a good idea. If you think of the commons in terms of a set of norms and rules.
Actually, I'll be clear. I'm talking about Creative Commons as an application of a digital commons. So
Oh, sorry, I didn't get the creative.
yes, yeah. I mean, so it's kind of become the paradigm alternative, in digital spaces. But the kind of irony of our age right now is that the more that we put to the commons, the more that we give to these AI engines, which feed into your system.
Sorry, I didn't hear the creative somehow.
Oh.
Creative Commons, as many of you will know, is a way of organizing the norms and rules as to who can use what data and information under which circumstances. And instead of it being solely the right of the company, the private sector, the corporate entity to decide that, it's there for the public's use unless you restrict it and then be used commercially. One of the issues that is being pointed to is the more we develop the commons, is the more and more data in there, the more the AIs and algorithms are going about saying, oh, we'll use that, we'll anonymize that, and now we'll come and make some more money using it, and where's the boundary lie? I imagine there'll be legislation in this area in due course. There's already discussions about it. I honestly don't know where it will end up, but I think that wherever it ends up, it's not a good solution. Because once again, I come back to the fact that if you take the balance word again, there'll be an imbalance between the interests of the companies of subverting in one way or another some way of continuing to develop their technologies and leaving us, those who generate the data, with relatively less control about the way in which our data is used, managed, and whether we can make money from it.
One more question. Somebody wants to jump in. I'll give you the last word.
Oh, well, I just want to thank you very much for a really enlightening conversation and lots of stuff to think about and discuss from this today. So thank you so much. We can go for 5 minutes.
Probably great. No, we have probably great. And we're going to move really quickly. We're going to pour coffee quickly, and we're going to come back for the panel session. What time do we start? We start again, that's a very good question, at, 10:30.
You can leave your stuff here if you want. Everyone's coming back in, I think.
All of this data. Is information. Yes. I'm right. What's the direction? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna if you have a, other advice. No, it's okay. I'm gonna go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, then you feel the need. Problem, they're doing it all the time. Whenever I'm at the
Those, yes.
Welcome back to the second part of the morning session of this beautiful day in Oxford. Last week, I was on the other side of the channel, France, and people crack jokes about the English weather. I think they are just jails. Okay, we've got a plenary panel with 4 distinguished speakers. The panel is called Key Paradoxes of the Global Far Right in the Era of Displacement and Social Change. I will start the introduction according to the alphabet order. It's okay. The first speaker is Dr. William Pocock. He's an adjunct associate professor in politics and international relations at Richmond, the American University in London. He's an expert on radical right extremist social movements in the United Kingdom, Western Europe, and globally. He has most recently advised the British, American, and Australian governments on their approach to the radical right extremism. His recent book is Moving Beyond Islamist Extremism, Assessing Counter-Narrative Responses to the Global Far Right, published recently by Columbia University. The second speaker is Dr. Michał Garapik, senior lecturer at University of Roehampton in London, Great Britain. He's an anthropologist and author of an award-winning monograph using intimate ethnography. Dzieci Kazimierza, 2019, Catholic Children, and over 60 publications in English, Polish, French, and German. He specializes in the issues of migration, transnationalism, memory, far-right radicalization, resistance, homelessness, Polish Roma, and intimate ethnography. And his fieldwork experience includes Britain, Poland, Ukraine, and Peru. Elżbieta Konolczuk is an associate professor in sociology. She works at Södertörn University in Stockholm, in Sweden, and American Studies Center in the University of Warsaw in Poland. Her research interests involve social movements, politics of reproduction, as well as right-wing populism and mobilizations against gender. Her most recent book is monograph Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Moment, written with Agnieszka Graf, published by Routledge, and the book received the Bronisław Malinowski Award. Congratulations. The last, but certainly not least, Professor Rafał Grubowski, the chair of the Global Studies Research Network. Rafał is a truly Renaissance person. He holds 3 MAs in religious studies, theology, and European studies. He obtained his PhD in political science from the University of Surrey in Britain. Currently, Rafał lectures at the Richmond University in London. We are going to follow the following schedule. We will start with presentation, around 15-minute speech, and then we will have 20 or 30 minutes for an open door and discussion. Thank you much, and I'm inviting Rafał. Rafał, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for the generous introductions. Welcome to the second day of the conference. And yes, this panel is about the paradoxes of the far right, and our first presentation by myself and my colleague Michał, and also prepared by our colleague Anna Jochimek, who cannot be here, concerns one such paradox, namely immigrants joining far-right anti-immigrant groups, and those far-right anti-immigrant groups trying to target immigrants, some immigrants at least. This is part of an ESRC funded study of specifically Polish migrants joining far-right groups specifically in Britain. And how we got here? Well, I've known Michał for years, we've been friends in, I think, our undergraduate studies. And just before the pandemic, we thought that there is actually an interesting creative synergy between our research interests. Michał is an expert in Polish migrants, Polish minority in the UK. There's a book about London Polish borders, whereas my expertise has been in ideology studies, and particularly how ideology changes when subject to global and transnational processes. And we thought we could bring these two fields of expertise together to write this project and to actually got the funding. So this is an interdisciplinary project. I'm a political scientist, political sociologist. Michał is a social anthropologist. And specifically, while bringing those two broad disciplines together, the project concerns three specific areas of study perhaps. So certainly migration studies, studies of urban diversity. In the case of London, some have called this super diversity. Studies of conviviality, and a very important, for us, very important concept, integration through racism. This is this mundane discourse through which migrants try to establish their place in the ethnic, cultural, racial hierarchy of the UK, trying to position themselves as close as possible to those whom they view as being in power, namely the white Brits. The second area that we focus on in this study is analysis of transnational political movements and political and social remittances, how these organizations, how these far-right groups operate transnationally, how do they learn through those transnational processes from one another. And the final field is the study of political ideologies and what happens when they are transmitted transnationally. What aspects get downplayed, what aspects become more for granted. We believe that this study, and this will become clear as we proceed with the presentation, and Michał will explain this in more detail, it fills significant gaps in scholarship and addresses some of the biases in scholarship of both migration and the far right. And we listed here some of those issues that we believe are problematic. Firstly, there is in both migration studies and the studies of far right this reluctance to bridge the dichotomy between natives and immigrants. Right? So the far right is treated as politics, a movement, an ideology that has risen reactively, in reaction, in response, in defense, as the far right would say to those reductively and homogeneously conceptualized immigrants, namely not natives. There is also an accompanying normative bias in migration studies, in the studies of political engagement of migrants, in that they are seen either as passive victims of oppressive state structures, or if they are considered to be politically active, then it's assumed that they inevitably engage in emancipatory, progressive social struggles. Whereas in our case, clearly this is not the case. We see Polish migrants engaging in politics that's not progressive. We think that there is also an unexplored dimension of cultural racism, social sciences, at least from this angle where we locate our research, have not yet engaged sufficiently in those constructions of hierarchies of whiteness and belonging, particularly in post-Brexit context, and we will talk a little bit more about this. And finally, there is also a limited recognition of the role of diaspora politics, the engagement of the Polish state, in this case, abroad, and what interests, what groups, what ideas it tends to promote. Let me move to a bit of background and context. This is an important research because Poles are the largest minority in Britain. Polish is the largest, most often spoken foreign language in England. In the UK, it's number 3, following English and Welsh. And numbers of Poles living here have risen quite dramatically since 2004, when Poland joined the EU. You can see the numbers on the right-hand side. Reached over 1 million by 2016, and then declined a little bit due to COVID, due to Brexit, due to economic decline in Britain and economic growth in Poland. But still, there are around 700,000 Poles living here, so this is certainly a sizable minority. Now, 2 generations in most cases, and they are present in all sectors of the economy, both dominating services, in construction, in hospitality, and they are now generally spread out across Britain, unlike earlier waves of Polish migration following the Second World War. And most of Polish people here accept British liberal democracy and live peacefully and are well integrated in the society, but there is a small but vocal minority that has engaged in acts of far-right violence or generating far-right hate speech online, and this has been widely reported by the media, also by Polish NGOs operating here. So these are just some examples. In our research, we focus on several kinds of actors to study those trajectories of radicalization, how radicalization occurs, and who are the main mediators. So we focus on British branches of organizations established in Poland. And here you have several pictures. So you have the National Rebirth of Poland, a fascist organization that actually is now much stronger in the UK than it is in Poland. In Poland, it's a big decline, but not so much in the UK. You have the National Radical Camp about outside Polish Embassy in London. This is an organization with roots in mid-1930s. I think that's then also at the bottom of the slide, you can see this war veteran. That's an important element to note. There is this attempt to establish continuity between heroism of Polish soldiers during the Second World War and their contribution to victory of the Allies and current far-right politics. Here you can see this far-right Libertarian Party. They have, quite recently, they had this other political picnic near Manchester. There is some interesting debate about whether they should be let into Britain, and there were attempts by the British government to stop them, on some occasions successful. So these are British branches of organizations established in Poland. There are also locally grown organizations that have no equivalence in Poland, but that were established here by Polish migrants. Patriot Fidelis is one example. One of their campaigns was a campaign to defend a Polish church in Bristol. They also engaged in manifestations against Black Lives Matter groups. They engaged in protests against abortion, liberal abortion policies. The leader in the middle. And then on the right-hand side, you have the logo of another important initiative. Some of those Polish far-right groups are quite keen to take care of Polish graves, the graves of Polish soldiers. And there are actually interesting political struggles around who can claim the legacy to this history embodied in those graves. And then, capturing the transnational dimension of this phenomenon, we also have British far-right groups, as I mentioned at the beginning, actively recruiting Polish migrants. So on the left-hand side, that's Jada Franson from Britain First. That was a few years ago, and specifically trying to convince Poles to vote for Britain in the election. In the middle, the English Defence League, which had a Polish branch for a period of time. And on the right-hand side, you can see Tommy Robinson, former leader of EDL, who regularly visited Poland and reported from the Independence March that takes place on the 11th of November each year, and as Michał will discuss, is one of the largest events of the far right in Europe. There are also Poles acting in far-right political parties or sort of far-right territories of more mainstream parties. So Daniel Kaczynski on the left-hand side, aside from being the tallest member of Westminster, he also has contacts with the likes of Salvini or Le Pen, well, the tensions between him and Boris Johnson. So even to the taste of Boris Johnson, of course, too, he was much on the right. And then you have Sebastian Ross, who is an activist of the far-right Libertarian Party that I showed on the previous slide, but here campaigning, standing for UKIP. So an interesting combination there. I also mentioned those Polish states diaspora engagement policies. Polish government have been known for supporting some of these groups. Poland has been under the control of what I would consider far-right party, Law and Justice. So here concerns in the press. Finally, another development that we found and are trying to study is the Warriors of Mary, all male fraternity. We suspect that there is development in that direction, that this is perhaps a safe haven for some of those far-right groups. After all, what could be wrong with the religious organization? Perhaps there is a possibility to evade the control of the authorities. The group was established in Poland, but is extremely active in Putney, in London, and in some other locations. So the question is, what is really going on here? Why are immigrants attracted to far-right groups? And how come British far-right groups are recruiting them? And for explanation, I'll turn to my colleagues.
Thank you very much for that. Well, we won't be able to give you all answers to these questions. As Rafa mentioned, the study is just at its early stages. We're still just entering the field. So the open profile is still ahead of us. But there are certain factors that we need to take into account. And the most important is that all these, for someone not familiar with Polish history and Poland, details that might be confusing, strange, all these graves, soldiers, and historical references are really important political and cultural symbolic capitals. They provide certain resources for global far right. And this is quite interestingly shown and evidenced by, for example, the fact that Donald Trump, for his first visit to Europe, decided not to go to Brussels or Paris or London or other Western capitals, but also was the place where he decided to go first on his first European trip, and where he positioned Poland as this bastion of all traditional values, the European values, Western values, which Poland allegedly defended throughout all this history. And there was a very strong military, symbolically rooted in history discourse there. And Trump was very adamant there, and interestingly also he was met with quite a good response. As you might remember, there was some worry around his entourage that goes to any other capital in Western Europe, might be met with strong protest, one being very nice on the screens. Now, in Poland, they have it. It's not that everybody is praised this kind of clock, but still, it's not a really response to one clock. And so globally, Poland does resonate there. And as Rappel mentioned, on the 11th of November, every year, there's a big ritual march, a celebration of, historically, it's a celebration of Polish independence day, but it grew into a hub of transnational far-right groups with activists from US, Canada, Italy, Hungary, basically linking up, networking, exchanging information and ideas. So this kind of Poland has developed this ritual space to speak to for reproduction of certain ideas and symbols. However, we still are kind of uneasy with that because it's not that those export nationalistic ideas as this kind of Eastern European nationalism. There is a tendency to essentialize the far-right and nationalist ideas looking at these dynamics the left. So, and also activists found not just the further ground, but the residents in Britain. So it wasn't just a matter of Polish nationalism being directly transplanted from Poland to the UK, but a sign of something going on in Britain itself. So something around going on in post-Brexit, cultural, political turmoil, nationalism, and other things. But clearly there's something, this is something new that will be explore further and give more data to on the rise of politically silent, politically active, politically impactful white supremacy and transnational whiteness is a process that we identify as in looking at this process and similar whiteness as in the work on critical whiteness studies under Western and like that. Similar to masculinity is whiteness is bigger than blue. It establishes an order of and a certain hierarchy within boundaries constantly adapted to the situation. So and in politically volatile and important historical moments, whiteness reveal itself as this powerful resource which can mobilize groups across national boundaries. And Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans broadly, because they occupy this this peculiar space in Britain in terms of the skin color, they can be classified as white privilege, but at the same time, as this not entirely Western European. So that status can be channeled into white supremacy clearly. Structurally, they still occupy a quite different niche, or it's a negotiable niche. It's important to take into account that this provides a cultural and symbolic political environment where white supremacy can emerge, become politically powerful. So in essence, it's the development of that notion developed through by Fox and Galiska, a form of, they call it sometimes psychological integration to race. So where our contribution lies, we think, and we hope, is a kind of providing a non-obvious way to look at far right as a local movement, where a combination of transnational, not national ideologies are then enacted and modeled in a very local context, using very particular symbolic resources. So we still are in the number of people looking at this process of identification, political digitalization, or what it means white, British, European, against the new enemy, new however constructed threat to Western supremacy, white supremacy. I think that exploration of transnational dimension of our ideologies is going to be super important. It's about organizations, symbols, and obviously, as we've seen, there's a lot of death there, a lot of graves, a lot of references to military past. That's also very politically important, and activating certain ideas. So how these ideas circulate in a transnational milieu will be of the study, and how exactly and why ethnographically and look also through the eyes of activists. This is something we will hopefully tell you about next year or in the following years. So watch this space. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Okay, I'll just better time to make sure that I don't spend. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Especially since I'm social movement and gender scholar, I don't have that much knowledge about globalization. So I've learned a lot from you all, and I hope to learn even more today and tomorrow. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for your organization. And I would like to focus on a very specific part of globalization as a theme, because I would like to focus on the critiques of globalization. And for me, in social movement scholar, it's very important to observe that whereas in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, the critiques of globalization were coming mostly from other globalization movement, which was basically the left movement, or progressive, however we want to describe it. By 2016, 2023, it is the right, and often the extreme right, which offers the most intense, or at least widely heard critiques of globalization. And that was something that struck me when I looked at the anti-gender movement, both in Poland and globally. How much they talk about globalization or indeed globalism, and I will come back to this differentiation later. So basically, how much they want to pose as the defender of the common law of people against the global powers of capital and liberal elite. And before I start, probably I should explain what I mean by anti-gender, especially in the British context. The struggles around gender within broader women's movement are mostly between, let's say, gender critical feminists and well, gender feminists, how we call it. Whereas in most other contexts, I would say Poland, and I've been studying Poland, Italy, France, Spain, and a couple of others, Central Eastern European countries, the anti-gender means basically anti-feminist, anti-LGBTQ rights, anti-reproductive rights, the whole sort of socially ultra-conservative agenda. So this is what I'm talking about. And I would like to point your attention to the ways in which this shift from who is talking and how they are talking critically about globalization, what are the political and social consequences of this shift?
And I would like to look at the ways in which the global, of course, because it is global, anti-gender movement has framed globalization as a threat. But also I would like to focus on the issue of gender and how gender plays out in these discourses and narratives. And first, probably I should explain to you what is the anti-gender movement, because it has its iterations, it has its global places and networks, but it has also local elements. And of course, as it is usually the case with socially conservative ideas, the religion is there. So if we dig into the origins of the anti-gender discourse, we can look at the Vatican and its efforts in the United States to stop institutions such as UN even use the term gender in its international treaties or documents, and basically that was very much concerned with women's rights and reproductive rights at the moment. But if you look at the ways in which this movement has evolved, you can clearly see how it has become an actual social movement with the grassroots element in it, and how it moves towards a political movement. And when it comes to the policy goals, it differs in different countries, of course. In Sweden, where I work, it will be mostly against gender studies, gender theory, anti-discriminatory, norm critique education in schools. In countries such as Poland, it will be abortion, reproductive rights, very obvious anti-LGBTQ positions. And of course, on the international level, it will be, for example, the Istanbul Convention, which aims to protect women from gender-based violence. And as I said, it is, and that was the origin of my question yesterday with the plenary speaker about the illiberal civil society, because it is a clearly case of illiberal civil society, in a sense that these are organizations which are both local, national, and transnational. And you have a lot of networks, a lot of platforms which bring those people together. And I had a pleasure to be at the conference of the World Congress of Families, an organization established in the 90s in the United States with the help of some Russian intellectuals. And they have organized these big congresses in many cities, like Madrid, Mexico. In 2019, I was in Verona. And it was very interesting to observe something that we have conceptualized together with Agnieszka Graf as opportunistic synergy. This synergy between civil society actors, religious fundamentalists, and political actors, especially from populist right. So we think that actually connecting with those socially conservative ideas help populist actors, populist parties to sort of strengthen the ideological core, which in the case of right-wing populism often happens to be quite weak, quite, I would say, elusive. And here we have, Mr. Salvini, by then the Prime Minister, who has been really enjoying a lot of attention, a lot of applause during the World Congress of Families. And Giorgia Meloni was one of the guests there as well, and she's an excellent speaker, I must say. I was really impressed by her because she knows how to make an impression. And of course, now she is the Prime Minister. That as the female, gender Prime Minister, which is supposed to show that we have gender equality. We do have a lot of gender equality on the right, actually. That's something that we should look at more closely. And also, I would like to point your attention to organizations such as Citizen Go, which uses you're probably familiar with Abbas, maybe. Anyone signed petitions for Abbas, for example? Move on. Most of them people here. I'm surprised. So look it up, because it's a new form of mobilizing people for petition drives and also for small donations, which is international, and Citizen Go is actually extremely active in many contexts. Now very much in African contexts, for example, they have supported the Hildegard's law in Uganda, for example, and they have been very much doing this kind of transnationalization of the right-wing agenda. So if we look at that, we can see that these guys are very much global, but at the same time, they are very vocal against globalism. But before we go to the question of globalization, globalism, let's look at how we signify the concept of gender, right? Which have been around for quite a long time. Of course, there are a lot of discussions within the family theory or gender studies. What is it? Is it fluid? Is it structured? Is it something that's connected to biological sex by definition or not? But at least for the last 10 years, we have tendency for classification of this term in a new way. So gender has been signified, first of all, as this kind of floating concept, floating signifier, linking those shifts in gender identity, sexuality, kinship, reproduction, family, which are often seen as dangerous by the right. But at the same time, what's happening is that gender in the discourse has become a way to strengthen, but also to moralize the binary between local and global, authentic and colonial, sovereign and colonial. So this has been both, I would say, spatial dimensions that was very much tackled in this discourse, but at the same time, moral ethical dimension attached to that. And it is not a coincidence that gender has become useful for different groups in different contexts to actually create this sense of being an underdog. So gender, especially gender theory or gender ideology, has been equated with ideological colonization and hence global, right? And Gabriel, who is a German sociologist, probably better known in other countries, especially Poland, Croatia, and Central European countries, rather than in Germany, because published a lot of books on the dangers of sexual ideology or sexual change. She said the global, and I quote here, the global sexual revolution is now being carried out by power elites. These include international organizations such as the UN and the EU, global corporations like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, the big foundations like Rockefeller and Guggenheim, extremely rich individuals like George Soros or Warren Buffett, and non-governmental organizations like an International Planned Parenthood organization, federation. So in a way, the changes in sexuality, identity, family are being recast as an elite project, then sort of used to colonize local populations. And you can see here the banner from one of the protests that I attended in Poland, and with this phrase, gender as Ebola from Brussels. So there's really this element of evoking contagiousness, evoking the idea that gender is basically a disease, and it is foreign, and you should really look closely, where did it come from? Where did the colonizers came from to colonize us? And here we come to the question of globalization or globalism, how it is reframed in connection to the question of actual colonization and anti-colonial struggles, because I think that this is exactly where the really important part comes in. So this ideological colonization by gender, and then of course you can use different terms such as cultural Marxism, you probably have heard that, or wokeism, or cancel culture. Depending on the context, they will have more or less traction. They become part of a project of elite intervention. And this is exactly where the anti-gender discourse verges or actually smoothly transforms into a conspiracy theory. And this is exactly where some anti-Semitic elements come into it, and my friend have analyzed it in details, because it is quite often that if we have a sort of anti-elite discourses, especially connected to economic elite within extreme right, it's not far away from saying that these are the Jews who are, of course, trying to colonize and trying to rule us. And here, of course, we have this connection of the Jewish people as morally corrupt, as perverse, and the process of colonization by gender. And it is very important that when it comes to the critiques of globalization, these actors are very much focused on something that, following up at the right, we can call as ethnoscapes and idioscapes, right? So they are not very much focused on economic processes or transformation of technologies. They are very much focused on the movement of ideas and the movement of people. And this is actually where the question of racism and Islamophobia comes in, because the critiques of economic elements of global capitalism are very much linked to the idea of moral corruption of this elite. So in that sense, they create this tight connection between the global elites of rulers, let's say, perhaps Jews, of course, who are trying to actually dissolve the nation and the family, which is the foundation of the nation, in order to push for mass migration, which then will create a new class of people around the globe who will be subjected to this colonization because they will lack strong cultural ties, strong ideas, and so on. And then in the Polish case, of course, there is this idea that we are between the East and the West in a sense, and therefore the West tries to make sort of middle ground in Poland, trying to colonize it also economically. Therefore, at least until the war on Ukraine broke, the idea was that Russia was the savior of the West from its own corruption. So, to conclusions, what is the outcome of that? First of all, if you create this sense of cultural colonization as an imminent threat to children, families, it is very easy to demonize minority groups as violent colonizers, because by extension, the feminists, the genderists, the LGBTQ people, and also racialized minorities become part of the same process of violent colonization. Another important element is the appropriation of right discourses and anti-colonial imagery, because what happens is that when the right uses this anti-colonial frame as the main frame of their discourse, it actually blurs and obliterates the actual history of colonization and the question who were the colonizers. And I'm thinking about not only the question of race, but also of the role of the church, for example, the Catholic Church, as the ultimate colonizing institution. And also what is happening is the process of strengthening the trend that we all know is happening, the trend of culturalization of political and power divide. So it's no longer, you should no longer look at who has actually power, who actually has value. Rather, we should look who has the sort of cultural hegemony and identify them as the ultimate danger. And gender, as it is signified by the right, facilitates this reconfiguration and also brings a very important emotional element to this. Who doesn't want to protect children? The innocent, the small, the ones who are in danger. Who doesn't want to protect families? I mean, we all love families and we cherish them. So this emotional element, which is close to heart, makes it quite difficult to actually expose those discourses as based on racist, misogynist
Just So, I'll be presenting on a paper that I had published a couple of years back now with the Council for European Studies at Columbia University, those online journal for Europe now. My research on the far right has mainly been contained to look at the kind of anti-Islam protest movement. So, yeah, going on from the kind of social movement sides. And in this paper, what I was keen to examine is how the far right uses kind of free speech defences as part of the strategy of othering. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a second. So this to kind of start some context, we've seen quite a lot of literature that's focused on the question of what some people term as liberalism's kind of paradox, or particularly what we term as kind of new far rights, and how they use liberal values in a liberal setting, either to kind of other immigrants or in this case Muslim populations. One kind of key development of this kind of use of liberal language. So one aspect is the use of gender, so using it as a way of saying, oh, Western values involve gender equality, but those from the East or migrants or people with Islam don't necessarily hold those progressive values. But one other aspect that we've seen developing is using freedom of speech as a key part of their kind of favour, as it were. And what I kind of touched upon in the paper in terms of the threats perhaps associated with it, sort of look terribly dangerous on the surface, is specifically that he wrote an essay mainly in the context of communism, but around this distinction between a heresy, which he becomes legitimate in a democracy, involving kind of unpopular ideas or kind of concepts and conspiracies. This idea of ideas that might actually actively erode or undermine the values within a democracy, including freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So I'll talk about this in terms of three kind of key case studies more recently. So I'll look at Tommy Robinson and his Free Tommy protest that happened about 5 or so years ago. I also look at Milo Yiannopoulos, who's kind of fallen out of the news now, but he did some kind of campus campaigns back about 5 years or so ago, and then also some of the trials against the Dutch kind of anti-Islam firebrands, Geert Wilders, head of the Freedom Party. And what I do in the paper is kind of quiz what's the kind of veracity behind these statements, the legitimacy and the authenticity, and whether they're part of this what's described as this kind of conspiracy to undermine liberal democracy. So the first case study, it's interesting because Tommy Robinson now is under some legal challenges around contempt of court related to a different case. But this particular episode of protest was around the former EBL leaders committing contempt of court by filming outside of the trial, and therefore kind of exposing the identity of defendants in that trial, and in such a way risking the collapse of a trial and a break around child sexual exploitation, which was happening at the time. And what's quite interesting in terms of monitoring some of Tory Robinson's discourse during and around these protests, it certainly doesn't shy away from again being involved in legal action. Was really trying to connect it with this narrative of being kind of silenced, as you can see from some of the placards that were being held, and how he was sort of this champion of free speech, and he goes into this quite a lot in his kind of autobiography as well, which is titled "Enemy of the State." Robinson's supporters also kind of continually used bridging narratives as well, in order to kind of connect this with the core kind of ideological kind of claim, as it were, of his activism, which was that basically he was kind of voicing critical stances around Islam, and that's why he was being kind of imprisoned, kind of maybe a plot by the state to shut him up. And then another interesting one when it comes to free speech is this kind of I'm terming here as anti-racism, or kind of a reversal of anti-racist language, basically saying that that anyone who engages in kind of criticisms need to get shut down, but also using the language of being this kind of embattled minority. So a key legacy effect of this has been Tommy using these kind of narratives around victimization in connecting these free speech. The next case study is Wiley Yiannopoulos. He recently came to light as being involved with Kanye West's kind of anti-Semitic meltdown. Don't want these stories are particularly true. But back in 2016 and 2017, to give you some context, he was kind of a key light within the US alt-right kind of scene. He was going around doing kind of free speech type tours in the US. One thing that's kind of borrowed from this alt-right subculture is that Yiannopoulos used a lot of human jokes, mainly as a way of going forward his kind of plausible deniability around using either kind of racist or hateful language. Another one from some of the speeches that he made at various campuses, a lot of these were shut down, unfortunately, was again using free speech claims of victimhood, and he was kind of saying that he was saying that, oh, I'm trying to be outlandish and kind of edgy, I'm not kind of really necessarily believing what I'm saying, I'm just kind of trying to be provocative. So in terms of the bottom line here, he also engaged in some kind of anti-Islam language. He talks about kind of Islam as being equal to hate speech, and Islam as an ideology as opposed to religion, which is often quite a key rhetorical strategy used by these kind of Islamophobic actors. But he tries to mask his kind of intolerant rhetoric using this kind of banner of free speech and putting up the confidence rules. Now, the final case study that I discussed in the paper is Gear Builders, and and two trials in particular. One was unsuccessful around some comments he made about the Quran promoting terrorism in 2010, and then another in October 2016, which came off the back of some comments that he made in the 2014 general election, making a crowd chant for fewer Moroccans in the Netherlands. And that was successful. That was mainly related to what happens in terms of his targeting of specific people groups. And that has a bit of a lower kind of criminal threshold in Dutch law in relation to hate speech. So again, Bill is keen in his kind of statements in relation to these trials and trying to authenticate his position as a victim and this free speech advocate. He again suggests that that he tries to kind of broaden the kind of stakes, as it were, in terms of the trial, suggesting there's kind of political and that it's being used as a broader kind of strategy to silence and scapegoat radical political thought. Yeah, this is particularly instructive in terms of how state actors play a role in kind of critiquing and counterbalancing some of these free speech defences. If we go back to Tommy Robinson, the judge there was very clear in his verdict. He was sort of saying you're kind of using this kind of strategy of free speech, but actually you're involved in the terms of court, which ultimately would have led to the freedom of people who were later prosecuted for fairly kind of serious offences. So we do see some kind of stakes, which often these movements, they're trying to, new far-right movements, they're trying to distinguish themselves from the old far-right by saying, no, we're not racist, we just practical multiculturalism, which is what activists talk about to Hillary Clinton in her 2016 book. So what often happens in this discourse is also a kind of reversal of victim and perpetrator. So often, despite the kind of horrific acts that they've been associated with, they try to kind of frame themselves as a victim. This brief way that talks about in her 2015 book. And free speech is used in a way that's obviously regressive in terms of state institutions and free speech itself. These acts have very big megaphones, as it were, in the public sphere, and ultimately their ends of othering or kind of diminishing the rights of minorities is actually eroding the possibilities of free speech for other people. So I think I'll stop there and take a lot of questions and Q&A. There's a QR code to the article on that final slide. So thank you.
Thank you very much for delivering thoughts. We have still 30 minutes left, so I think we will start with questions, comments from the audience, and if there is some time left, maybe I will back up for our extension. Okay? Any questions, comments, critique? Okay.
Thank you so much, because these people are very scary and they are realities. So I'm going to make out my campus to be much more interesting than it really is, although we had the attack that we did. So a few years ago, we had to deal with a young student who felt disaffected, and she is the reason that that unmentionable person, JP, was launched to international fame. So she decided to launch a society for free speech, and she labeled a speaker series as Speakers with Unpopular Opinions, and she invited a woman called Faith Goldie to speak on the campus of the University of Waterloo. To get an idea, I don't know if you've heard of her, she's awful. I think she was banned finally from Twitter, but if you had the unfortunate experience of reading her tweets, her kind of logo was something about God, and that contrasection dethrones God. So you've got an idea about who she is. Anyway, so this young student decides to show us a thing or two and to taste freedom of speech by inviting this person to campus. And so we're all getting together and talking about what can we do. Do we buy all the tickets so no one is there? One of us is there. Do we have a party next door to her so that everyone goes to the party rather than to her talk? Do we have a demonstration outside? Because unfortunately, what these people want is an altercation. They want to escalate things, but we kind of got deep into anything by the fact that the university, it was very conservative, but it kind of used the cost of security as a way to block her, because they said, if you're going to bring this person on campus, you have to pay, I don't know, it was 5,000 Canadian dollars for the security. So these things are very immediate, because this young student was at Laurie, and we can blame her for that person whose name I won't utter. So it's very difficult. How do you deal with these people is a critical question. How do you teach to MAGA students like them? Anyway, that's a story. I guess I'm kind of timely in response to the comments, but it seems to me, after hearing the discourse from the panel, that even at our core, those of us who don't consider ourselves parts of these movements have some very similar values, but they have been perversive in other ways. I wonder if the panel has any suggestions for trying to find that common ground where, when we talk about human rights, that's really, when we talk about the family, like we all, I think, can agree that we want to support the same things, but when they have been so perverse, I don't know if you guys have any ideas for teaching or coming together where we seem to have very similar values, but they seem to have been polarized.
I'm just wondering, the model that they said that was certainly serves the paradigm for many of these discussions. And so that was an excellent connection, I thought. The other thing is, I'm wondering to what extent these are arguments that are really kind of about legally.
Okay, so yeah, the question of how to deal with that, I guess that connects the two first questions, comments. I think that we have to really go case by case, because I think especially at the university, the question is what is the difference, especially within the university as an institution, between freedom of speech and academic freedom. And I think that this is the moment where we really have to step in and protect university from or the space of discussion from promoting ideas and claims which has been challenged by science, which has been proved wrong by scholars, which are basically false, which are basically lies, right? Like, connection between autism and vaccination. I mean, this is exactly where I drew a very strong line saying, no, this is not true, and this is not it doesn't have any space within academic institutions and preferably anyone else. When it comes to the question of ideas and differences in ideas, this becomes much more blurry. And I must say, a real problem with for example, banning or, trashing these debates, which do not cross this line between violence and lies, and which are actually presenting different set of values. And I really like us to have a lot more of those discussions than we actually have. And I'm thinking not only within this broad spectrum of polarized society, but also within universities, which tend to be more or less liberal, depending on the context. But I think that from my perspective, for example, the situation now that we can't really talk about different views on the nature of gender or what gender is, I find it really, really problematic. Because it doesn't mean that the controversy will go away. It just means that we won't find any ways to talk about it. And I think that this finding common ground, it is not possible with people like Miloyanopoulos, because it's not his goal to have a conversation, right? We can't have a conversation with people who are choosing to be trolls and whose political agenda is very dangerous. But we can choose to talk to people who are in the middle ground, sort of, who especially students who are in the process of forming their opinions. And I think that the most my choice would be to talk more about actual solutions than about ideological differences. And I had this conversation with students, for example, about the issue of, let's say, why should men have the right to decide on women's abortion, right? So I had this conversation with them and asking them, okay, but what does it mean? Should women have the right to decide on vasectomy? And then if yes, because this is exactly the same type of situation, deciding on other people's reproductive capacities concerning their bodies. So my question was, okay, so how do we legislate that? Should we give women this right after one night stand? Or maybe after a week of, being in a steady relationship? Or maybe only in marriage, right? And then when we have these discussions, that becomes a real discussion about what does it mean to have a power over someone's body, rather than, this very general abstract discussion about whether it is life, a human being or something else. So I think that we really have to have an idea of, how to actually talk about possible solutions rather than start and usually end up in this very, abstract level of how do we imagine, the world function. So yeah, I could go on, but I'll just shut up now.
I've done quite a bit of research in terms of house narratives, so I probably speak to that. I think an organisation that was good to the no platform policy is a fairly good way of stopping these movements from kind of growing and metastasizing. There's obviously kind of key fallouts or dilemmas around that in terms of fueling grievances. In terms of like house narrative research, what's interesting there is that a lot of scholars looking at it in relation to extremist and terrorist organizations and movements find it better to talk about kind of alternative narratives. So thinking about ways that you could probably open up a different kind of discourse or possibility of discussion outside of the main kind of arguments and tropes that these groups kind of delve in, because what happens is you end up giving legitimacy perhaps to their kind of discourses and narratives. So that's one way of kind of seeing a way of kind of flipping the switch in terms of trying to kind of outmode them, as it were. But then, yeah, it goes back to that question of how to kind of to combat inauthentic expressions of kind of liberal values, which is quite a difficult one, especially when on the surface they kind of try to present themselves as kind of the kind of the capacity of things. Is quite hard, I think, from the left or kind of progressive left to try and unpick some of these kind of complexities around what they're trying to do in kind of public discourse and debate. So any good answers around that are very much welcome.
Well, thank you. I 5 minutes. Okay. I'll be sure. I would like to values and meaning of your this number of it. And I think as a scholar, as an anthropologist, I have the duty to actually understand the human behind the hate, the ideas, the violence that is out there. I obviously can, there's a lot of things that I have to suppress in my kind of thinking about the field that we are just entering, but hey, this is my job to understand why people hate, and also why people believe in certain ideas that we are, all things that we know are untrue. But there's some scholars might obviously engage in trying to counter, for example, narrative around the that. And yes, it might be a productive engagement. I see my task, and I think scholarly disciplines. One of the tasks is really, it doesn't matter actually. The fact here is the relevant is why that particular idea, what I believe there is that read the stuff. And we see that doesn't translate into significant quality and sharing. In dealing with people who wish me or others, we are, I think, how we do that to I think I mean we discussed a lot. I think imagine the ethics of research is very it's a nice, it's a fascinating area. So at the same time, I agree with that there's this lovely expression by Joe Fisher, who stuff on the video and Tom Robinson as well, of the non-dehumanizing principle. It's raises the models of family is this is the project, yeah, that this is what we have to do.
I think I have very little time to say very briefly.
2 minutes, okay.
I can only echo Michal in this respect, and this reflects the debates that we've had. I mean, as a person with a certain set of values, I would like the far right values outright defeated, right? But at the same time, as a scholar, I have a duty to understand and to see the person behind the ideology, at least in this professional capacity. That's what my duty is. As for how to deal with preaching of hate and far-right individuals gaining access to public fora, I mean, we don't have an unequivocal answer, but what we aim to study are the implications of the policies of the British government, which banned access, which banned entry for some Polish far-righters into the UK. We suspect that some of them actually were delighted with this, that it really gave them this platform to project themselves as victimized, as oppressed, as, you know, that's what we told you, right? There is no freedom of speech. I don't know yet what we'll conclude. We'll be studying this quite closely, but we see that there is such an opportunity for them. So I'm not sure what the solution should be. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so whichever room I was in. Cool. Yeah, no, I just don't need her.